The 2020 census just put its initial numbers out. If you're not familiar with this, basically every decade, the US government is required to count every person in the country and then release that information to the public. Not only is it just super interesting to see how many people there are and where they live, but the census data is used to determine how many members of the House of Representatives each state gets, and how many electors each state gets, something absolutely critical for any future presidential election. So this is a pretty big deal, and there's a lot of information to unpack. Welcome to Data Demystified. I'm Jeff Galak, and in this episode, I want to share with you my top 5 hot takes from the initial release of the 2020 census data. We're going to talk about these 5 things, and if you want to skip to any one in particular, I'll put a link to it below. So let's jump in with my number 1 hot take. California and New York, two very big and very Democratic-leaning states, each lost 1 congressional allocation. That's a big deal. But what's actually interesting here is that a lot of people are taking this to mean that the population of those two states has shrunk. After all, how we decide how many congressional allocations each state gets is based on how many people live in that state. So if a state like California lost a representative, surely their population went down, right? Well, not quite. In fact, if we just zoom in on California, we see that it has actually increased in population by a whopping 2.3 million people since the last census in 2010. That was the 3rd largest increase in population of any state behind Texas and Florida. So how can California increase its population but lose a seat? Well, it turns out what matters isn't how many more people California has, but rather how many more people California has relative to the rest of the country. And since 2010, the entire US population grew by 7.35%, while California's population grew by only 6.24%. In other words, if you look at all the other states together, they grew faster than California did. And as a share of the total population, California went from 12.09% in 2010 to 11.95% in 2020. It's not a huge change, but it's enough to cost them a seat. Though let's remember that California is still a huge state. It's the most populous state in the country with about 10 million more citizens than the next most populous state, Texas. And it would take the populations of the bottom 22 states to equal the population of California. So yes, they lost a seat, but California is still a powerhouse. Well, if the entire country's population went up by 7.35%, did any state's population actually go down? Yeah, and that's the second hot take. Mississippi, Illinois, and West Virginia all saw shrinking populations since 2010. They weren't huge numbers, with Mississippi's population dropping by just over 3,000 people, Illinois' dropping by just under 8,000 people, and West Virginia's dropping by about 58,000 people. And yet it's telling that during a time period where the country saw an added 22.7 million people, these states all shrunk. And for both West Virginia and Illinois, that resulted in a loss of a congressional allocation. Well, if these 3 states all saw decreases in population, who saw the biggest increases? That's our third hot take. In terms of percentage increases, there were a lot of winners. Utah, Idaho, Texas, North Dakota, and Nevada all saw their populations increase by more than 15%. Though it's worth noting that percent changes aren't always the most telling. If you exclude Texas from that list, the other 4 states saw less combined population growth than California, a state we said grew slower than the overall US population growth rate. And all 4 of those states saw no increases in congressional allocations, meaning that their growth is impressive, but at least for now, won't do much to change the political landscape in the country. And before I go to the next hot take, if you could take a moment to like this video, subscribe to this channel, and click that little bell icon so that you don't miss out on any new content I put out, I'd really appreciate it. Also, if you have other takes on these data, I'd love to hear about them, so post a comment below, and I'll make sure to keep the conversation going. With that said, let's see the next 2020 census hot take. Hot take number 4 is that the US population is still quite geographically concentrated. In both 2010 and now in 2020, it only takes the 9 most populous states to equal 50% of the population. This graph here shows you the percentage of total US population when you add up the population of each of the states. So if you take the top 9 most populous states, you get about 50% of the population. If you take the top 23 most populous states, you get 80% of the population. And to get to 90% of the entire US population, you just need the 31 most populous states. Another way to think about that is that roughly 20 out of 50 US states, or 40% of all US states, make up just 10% of the US population. Which brings us to my 5th and final, and to me personally, the most depressing hot take. You see, I grew up in New York, and one thing New Yorkers love to do is poke fun of Florida. I can't exactly tell you why that is, but it's absolutely a pastime of ours. And one thing we always had was that New York was a more populous state, giving us an absolutely idiotic and unfounded sense of superiority. But alas, that now is gone. As of 2020, the state of Florida officially has a larger population than New York. In fact, New York got bumped from being the third largest state to now being the fourth largest state, with Florida taking that coveted third place. Now, to be sure, there's still plenty us New Yorkers can make fun of about Florida, but we can no longer say that New York is bigger than Florida. And what hurts even more is that with this shift in population, Florida now has one extra congressional allocation, and New York has one less. Anyway, all kidding aside, there is a lot to unpack in the 2020 census, and as more fine-grained demographic data are released, you can bet I'll be digging into those so that I can bring you the most interesting conclusions. The census is an amazing exercise in civics and an amazing exercise in statistics. I can't wait to dig in more. Finally, as always, thanks so much for watching.